grandpa. Ryan sat in his car in the dark, staring at the back bumper of his brother's truck. He was at his parents' house. He'd grown up there. His family was inside waiting for him to arrive. All he had to do was get out of the car, walk up the front steps, and go in, just as he had done a million times since he was a child. This street was the street that he'd learned to ride a bike on. The curb that he was parked beside was the first thing that he'd ever run over with a car. He'd mown that lawn more times than he could count and had rung every doorbell in that neighborhood on Halloween nights, probably for more years than was socially acceptable. Ryan was home, and yet he felt as if he had never seen this planet before. Nothing looked right to him. Nothing was what it was supposed to be. On the seat next to him there was an old wooden box, surrounded by crumpled up brown wrapping paper that had covered that box for how long? He didn't even know. Inside that box was every doomsday weapon that had ever threatened to destroy the universe in every stupid movie he had ever seen. Not literally. Ryan wasn't sitting next to an actual bomb, but he was sitting next to something that had already broken down the fiber of his reality. His reality. What did that even mean? Reality was supposed to be absolute and well-defined. Perspective was supposed to be the thing that changed from person to person. In that moment, sitting in that car, Ryan didn't know how to tell the difference between the two concepts. He didn't know anything. You could have told him that gravity was a hoax, and in that moment he might have taken some time to consider the possibility. He looked away from his brother's bumper and toward the door of the house. There was a Mylar balloon tied to the front light, with the words "Happy Birthday" written on it in bold, colorful letters. It wasn't that his parents had overlooked the fact that Ryan was a fully grown adult and didn't need balloons anymore. They just loved the opportunity to be silly and treat their adult son as if he were a child, because it amused them. Seeing that balloon and understanding its purpose brought Ryan one step closer to reality. Outside of that car, the world went on just as it always had. Things were the same as he had always known them to be, except now he had a different perspective on them. The truth had been there all along, he just hadn't seen it before. This shouldn't have been as scary as it was, but he felt as if he'd just stepped off of a roller coaster and his head was spinning. There was no sense or reason to the world. There were no safe and comfortable rules that one could follow in order to exist here. The world was a psychologically abusive creature that wanted to play with its food before finally eating it. Somehow he'd always thought that he would have been prepared for this sort of thing to happen to him. He'd read so many books and watched so many TV shows about this sort of thing. He thought that it would have been cool and fun. But as he sat in that car with all of the doomsdays beside him, Ryan didn't know what to say or do next. There was no grand adventure unfolding. It just was what it was, and he had to deal with it. He looked down at the package beside him and the paper that it had been wrapped in, recalling the moment that the thing had come into his life. It felt like 100 years ago that he had woken up in his apartment to the sound of his cell phone blasting text message after text message from his mother, who knew that he would be trying to sleep in on the weekend, but who wanted to wish her boy a happy birthday in the most lovingly annoying way possible. He had been 27 years old when he woke up that morning, but how long ago had that morning been? He felt ancient and like a child at the same time. He felt stupid. He felt like he was being very, very dramatic about this whole thing, but he didn't know how else to handle it. After he woke up and took his morning shower, there was a knock on Ryan's door. When he opened that door, a man handed him the package and walked away. It was a small package, wrapped in the brown wrapping paper that Ryan had always associated with parcels in old movies. In those movies, it was always tied up with twine, but his package used packing tape. It had his name on it, but not his address. The address had been on a little paper invoice that the man had handed him along with the package and an envelope that contained a few documents. Instead of having his address, the package had instructions written in black marker, as clear as the sender could write those words, but they were still messy. The person who wrote those words had a shaky hand. Deliver to Ryan Marsh, no earlier than Saturday, June 4th, 2022. June 4th was his birthday, but it was also a very specific birthday. Why? When Ryan opened the envelope and looked over the documents, he found something that he never would have expected in a million years, a copy of his grandfather's will. In the will, and in a letter that his grandfather's attorney enclosed with it, it was explained that the package was to be delivered to Ryan on that specific day and no sooner. The package was not to be discussed with the family before its delivery. It was not to be opened before its delivery. From his grandfather, there was only a short message. "I just want someone to know." That was it. Had Ryan been close to his grandfather, this would have come as a surprise, but he would have at least understood why the package was being left to him. As it stood, Ryan had no clue. He was not the oldest grandchild, his brother was. He was not close to his grandfather. In fact, he barely knew the man. His grandfather had died 10 years earlier, and Ryan had a hard time remembering one conversation that he'd ever had with him before that death. Of course, he'd heard people talk about his grandfather over the years. His mother would tell stories from her childhood, or his grandmother would close her eyes and picture the way things had been way back when. But Ryan barely listened to those stories. They were about a man that he felt no real connection to. Now that man was the center of his universe. It felt as though the package were humming with power. Just having it sitting there next to him made Ryan feel as if he would get cancer and die before he could make it to his parents' front door. He picked up the package, keeping the brown paper wrapped around it because it felt wrong to touch the wooden box with his own hands. It was small, maybe 6 inches by 9 inches, and perhaps 3 inches deep. It was handmade out of strong, heavy wood with other types of wood used to create a design on top. It had a latch with a lock, but it hadn't been locked when he got the box. He didn't have the key for it. As he thought about that fact, he came to the conclusion that it didn't matter anymore. As far as his grandfather was concerned, the package would either be delivered to Ryan when it was supposed to be and opened when it was supposed to be, or someone would open it early. A lock wouldn't stop someone from getting into it if they really wanted to, especially if the key were delivered with the package. Ryan ran his finger over the locks as he thought about all of this. It was perhaps the first time in his entire life that he had ever thought about his grandfather as a person and considered how he would have felt about something. The first time that his grandfather had seemed like a real person and not just some shadowy figure that loomed over his family's past. The moment changed his view of the world once again. Grandpa was a person. He just wanted someone to know about the contents of this box because he wanted them to understand. He wanted Ryan to understand. But he didn't. Even if Grandpa was a person, he hadn't left a handwritten journal to explain this whole thing. He hadn't taken the time to sit down and actually tell Ryan how to put it all into context. It would have been very helpful if he had done that, but even as he sat there and wished for that explanation, Ryan didn't know how his grandfather could have done it. To explain it would have made it seem like a lie. How many times must he have sat down with a pen and paper and tried to find the words? Was that who his grandpa was? It wasn't what people had spoken about in Ryan's family, that's for sure. Or was Ryan projecting some sympathetic character onto the reality of the man that his grandpa was? Maybe. Then again, maybe the opposite was true as well. Maybe they were both inaccurate. Maybe they were both right. Ever since he had received that package, Ryan had been trying to understand his grandpa. He knew the man's name, and he knew when the man died. He knew bits and pieces of stories that he'd heard over the years. What he didn't know was who this person was. Alexander Carmack was his grandpa's given name. It was an uninteresting name, which didn't tell Ryan much. If there was a middle name, Ryan didn't know it. When Ryan thought of his grandpa, the first image that came to mind was a vague memory from when Ryan was very small. He remembered running around the backyard of his grandparents' house, chasing their old dog, Thor. It was winter, so there were no leaves on the trees, and Ryan was bundled up warmly. He remembered stopping to catch his breath and seeing that breath in front of him with every exhale. At some point, Ryan looked toward the house, and he saw his grandpa standing on the back patio, just watching Ryan play with the dog. Grandpa had the faintest of smiles on his face that day. Ryan remembered it because Grandpa had a reputation for never smiling, never talking, never doing much of anything that he didn't absolutely have to do. When Ryan saw Grandpa standing there, Grandpa turned and walked back into the house. Rather than play with his grandson or even stay to watch him, Grandpa chose to turn away. That was always the impression that Ryan had of his grandfather. The man could have chosen to be there, but never was. As he sat in the car, however, there was another memory that came to mind. He remembered sitting in his grandparents' house, playing with toys all by himself, and his grandpa coming into the room to watch TV. Grandpa turned on an old episode of some sci-fi show and watched it without ever saying a word to Ryan, and Ryan never said a word to Grandpa either. But he sat there with his eyes glued to the TV because he had never seen a show like that before. Up until that point, it was all cartoon rabbits and fully grown adults talking to the camera with baby voices that annoyed Ryan even when he was a child. It was something that stuck with Ryan as he grew older because he loved sci-fi and comic books. Well, that said, it was hardly a bonding moment between him and his grandpa. Ryan remembered watching the show, but he didn't watch it while sitting on Grandpa's lap. It wasn't something that they did every weekend. Try as he might, Ryan couldn't understand why his grandfather chose him to deliver that package to. Was it because the old man didn't think that anyone else would understand? Because Ryan wasn't sure that he understood it either. When he got out of his car, Ryan was holding on to the package, still wrapped in the brown paper, trying to figure out what to do with the thing. His first instinct was to bring it inside, plop it down in front of the whole family, and see what they made of it. But Grandpa hadn't delivered it to the whole family. The package had been sent to him for a reason, and until Ryan had some time to sit with it and think about it, he wasn't sure that involving everyone else would be the best thing to do. Best case scenario, he would be throwing a wrench into their comfortable lives and making them question everything they thought they knew. Worst case scenario, their world would collapse entirely. The fabric of reality would come apart. Blood would rain from the sky. Demons would walk amongst us. The scary thing was, Ryan didn't even know if he was being too dramatic about any of this because he didn't know what was happening. He didn't have any answers for the long list of questions that his family would undoubtedly ask him if they saw that package. He put the package into the trunk of his car and locked it there. It would remain out of sight until Ryan was ready to face it once again. He wasn't sure when that time would be, but it wasn't as if the package contained some time-sensitive material. It had been sitting on a shelf somewhere for at least a decade since Grandpa died, probably even longer than that. Putting that package away and deciding to keep it to himself for the time being was the first step in dealing with the mystery in front of him. As he walked toward the front door of his parents' house, Ryan figured out the next step. He needed to understand more about his grandpa. In order to do that, he would need more information than he had in his own memory, which meant that he would need to ask others about the man. That was the plan, simple as it was. When he walked into the house, Ryan tried his best not to look as though he had just gazed upon the end of reality as he knew it. He was greeted by his parents at the door. His mother gave him a hug and a kiss on the cheek and rubbed his hair as though he were 5 years old. His father shook his hand and wished him a happy birthday. After they were done welcoming him, Ryan's brother Ty walked out of the kitchen holding onto a bowl of potato chips. He offered to shake Ryan's hand, but the offer was declined because of how greasy that handshake would have been. Grandma was in the living room, pretending to drift off to sleep so that she didn't have to help make dinner in the kitchen. Ryan always knew when Grandma was playing up the old woman act. They both thought it was hilarious when she made people repeat what they'd said several times, especially when they had to repeat the punchline of a joke, which lost all humor in the process. The family made small talk and went on like usual. His father told him that his other grandparents wished him a happy birthday from their home in Florida, and Ryan didn't even stop to wonder why they hadn't just called him themselves. It was strange how normal the night felt. It seemed as though the world should have stopped the moment that Ryan opened that package from his grandpa. But it didn't. Everything was the same as it had always been, and that was what gave Ryan the creeps. Every time he sat down for dinner with his family, for as long as he had been alive, that package was out there. The world hadn't changed at all. How could it have seemed so normal to him before, and so alien to him now? When things had quieted down in the house, Ryan went to one of the walls where his mother had hung some old family photos, and he looked through them as though there might be answers hidden within them. There were no answers. In fact, there weren't any photos of his grandpa at all. Ryan wasn't sure whether that was a decision that his mother had made or if there simply were no pictures to hang, but he thought it was strange. And yet, it had always been that way. He'd just never questioned it before. Ty was the only other person in the room with him now, and Ryan turned to him. He asked his brother what he remembered of their grandpa. What was his impression of the man? His brother shrugged and told Ryan that Grandpa was a creepy old guy. He didn't remember much beyond that, but as Ryan pressed for more from his brother, Ty told him that he'd always been intimidated by Grandpa. Ty remembered being a little kid and his parents taking him to Grandma and Grandpa's house. There was one day when everyone was outside except for Ty and Grandpa, and Ty just hid from the old man. He would run from room to room just to avoid being alone with Grandpa. Looking back on it as an adult, Ty could see that it was probably a little bit rude of him to treat his grandfather that way, but he couldn't help it at the time. But why? Ryan asked his brother what it was about Grandpa that made him so scary. Ty shrugged and said that Grandpa was always so quiet. He could be in the same room with a person and never say a word. He would watch people as they played games or baked cookies with Grandma, but he couldn't remember a time when Grandpa took part in those activities. He just sat quietly in the corner of the room. Sometimes he would stare out the window for hours, and still he wouldn't say a word. To Ty, Grandpa was creepy because even when he was there, he wasn't there. Ryan could understand that, because he remembered the man in much the same way, but at least he remembered moments when Grandpa appeared to be something more. Though Ty tried his hardest to remember something more about his grandfather, he couldn't do it. He didn't know Grandpa, and he didn't understand why Ryan was bringing him up now, after a lifetime spent ignoring the man. Ryan shrugged and told his brother that there was no good reason for it. It was a lie, but what was he supposed to tell Ty? That he had received a special inheritance from Grandpa, who hadn't bothered to send so much as a birthday card to Ty in his entire life? Once again, Ryan remembered that day when he was a child, playing outside and looking back at Grandpa. He didn't know whether he was seeing that memory in a new light now, or if he was making up details to fill a void. But he thought about Grandpa watching him play. He'd only turned away once he saw Ryan looking back at him. What had Grandpa been thinking about in that moment? Why hadn't he just grabbed a ball and joined in the fun? As Ryan asked himself that question, he thought about the wooden box that was sitting in the trunk of his car. It was made by hand, by Grandpa's hands. Its outside was smooth and polished, with different types of wood inlaid around it to make the thing into something more than just a box. It was made with care. It was made with purpose. Ryan tried to imagine the creepy old man who sat in the corner of a room as the same man who had taken the time to make that box, and it didn't make sense to him. Of course, Ryan already knew that there was more to this story. He knew what the inside of that box looked like, and he knew what the box contained. Ryan left his brother to his chips and his social media feeds, and he wandered through the house still looking at old photos and the knickknacks that had been collected over time. He thought about all of the little trinkets that people pick up over the course of their lives, and how those trinkets turn into vast collections. People fill houses with impulse buys. As he thought about this, he tried to think about his grandparents' house. He'd been there so many times over the years that he could close his eyes and walk through the place. He knew what every room smelled like, and how the old wooden floors made noises when you stepped on them. In his mind, he tried to think of some collection of Grandpa's, even if that collection was just a stack of books or movies, but he couldn't think of anything. Everywhere he turned his attention in that house, he saw remnants of his grandmother or the family that she and Grandpa had raised, but he didn't remember much from Grandpa himself. A few tools, maybe. That was it. Ryan walked into the dining room, where his father was sorting through some work papers that he had spread on the table. The family had never used the dining room for eating meals. They ate in the kitchen except for holidays. For the rest of the year, the dining room was a mess of work, storage, and dust. Ryan took a seat at the table and watched his father work for a few moments before his dad looked up at him with a puzzled expression. After some easing into the conversation, Ryan asked his father to tell him more about Grandpa. Ryan figured that this would be easier than asking his mother because he knew that his father would be more detached from the emotional aspects of Grandpa's life. He hadn't met Grandpa until he was already fully grown and preparing to marry into the family. Ryan hoped that this outside perspective might tell him something about Grandpa that he hadn't known before, and that hope was rewarded, perhaps not in the way that Ryan wanted, but in a way that added to the story. Ryan's dad recalled the first time that he had met Grandpa and the first impression that he'd had of the man. He told Ryan that when his mother brought him home to meet her parents, they were already engaged. His dad had expected some pushback from Grandpa, but things hadn't gone as he had expected. Instead of asking Ryan's father what his goals were in life or what he had to offer his new wife and the family that they would start together, Grandpa asked something else. He asked if there was someone else. He wanted to know if there was some other girl that he'd had his eye on, or some job that he could take in another city. He wanted to know what Ryan's dad was giving up in order to marry Ryan's mother. His dad thought this was strange. He'd expected a protective father, not a father who tried to convince him that there were better options out there. But eventually, Ryan's dad started to see it as a challenge. He saw Grandpa as someone who wanted his future son-in-law to understand what he was giving up by getting married, not just what he was gaining. Ryan's father said that Grandpa made him see what type of commitment he was signing up for, and that was not something to be taken lightly. Oh, Ryan's mother saw things differently when she heard about what her father had been asking. She thought that the old man was trying to stop the wedding because he didn't think that his daughter was worth loving. She was furious at Grandpa, according to Ryan's father, but this wasn't unusual. Ryan's mother had never been close with her father. She held on to a lot of anger toward him. Ryan asked his father if Grandpa was a bad man. His father took a moment to think about how he wanted to answer that question. Finally, he shook his head and said that he didn't think that Grandpa was bad. He thought that Grandpa was someone with a lot of demons, and he didn't know how to face those demons. He told Ryan that when someone was growing up back when Grandpa had grown up, going to therapy and getting help wasn't an option. People had to live with the things that ate away at them, and Ryan's father thought that Grandpa was someone who could have used some help along the way. He told Ryan that if he were to guess, looking back, he would say that Grandpa was probably a deeply depressed man. He was a man who wasn't comfortable going out into the world or interacting with people. Maybe that was some sort of anxiety, but Ryan's father wasn't a doctor and couldn't say for sure. What he told Ryan was that people are complicated, and even if someone causes others pain, it isn't always because they mean to. Sometimes they just don't know any different. His father told Ryan that by the time Grandpa died, he didn't even leave the house to go to work anymore. He had started making ends meet by watching the market and trading stocks. He was pretty good at it too, from what Ryan's father said. He even understood the value of cryptocurrency at a time long before it became trendy. Ryan's father then raised an eyebrow and wondered if there was a USB drive hidden in a box somewhere, with a fortune in long-forgotten Bitcoin just waiting to be found. It wasn't long after Ryan talked with his father that his mother called the family into the kitchen, where she was lighting candles on Ryan's birthday cake. It was a homemade cake. All of Ryan's cakes were homemade, for as long as he could remember. His mother always went out of her way to make them special, using fancy techniques and flavors. She would plan them months in advance. This year, she made a cake with flavors that were loosely based on an old-fashioned white cake soaked with a bourbon-flavored simple syrup, with orange cream inside, and a brown sugar bourbon buttercream, and garnished with maraschino cherries. Certainly not the type of cake that she would have made for him when he was a child. Upon smelling the cake, Ty urged Ryan to blow out his candles quickly, or else the whole thing might go up in flames. Ryan took a moment before blowing out those candles, and he looked at the people who were standing around him. They were all the same people that had been there for him since the day he was born. He knew them and loved them, but they didn't know themselves, not really. They didn't know what their very existence meant to the world. Ryan didn't even understand it yet. It felt as if one strong wind could blow apart every cell in his body. One wrong move, and his universe would dissolve into nothing. He blew out the candles, but he didn't make a wish. He didn't know what to wish for, or if he still had the right to make any wish at all. Smoke rose from the candles after he blew them out, and it swirled through the air, going higher and higher, until it faded into nothing but a scent that lingered in his nose. The cake was delicious. His mother had gone to so much trouble thinking of a concept and figuring out how to make that idea into a reality. She'd spent years learning the skills that had gone into the making of that cake and all of the cakes that had come before it. She'd spent years learning how to make Christmas cookies and sew Halloween costumes. She had spent his entire lifetime making herself into a person who displayed the love that she felt toward her family in every action that she took. There was no chance that anyone would ever be able to accuse her of not caring. Ryan appreciated that, now more than ever. After spending the day thinking about a man who had been a mystery even within his own family, Ryan recognized how important it was to his mother that her family knew she cared. After cake, everyone went into the living room and gathered around in order to make Ryan open presents in front of the entire family. He had always hated doing this, because he felt as if he were putting on a show for people who expected a certain reaction. He started with his present from Grandma, which was carefully wrapped and had a handwritten card taped to it. Grandma always wrote long letters in those cards, saying everything that she could possibly think to say to the people she cared about. She would recall memories from years before, or even jot down favorite recipes for foods that she normally made from memory. It was only as an adult that Ryan realized that she was doing this because she didn't know how long she was going to be with them and wanted them to know how she felt. If he collected those cards together, Ryan could fill a book with his grandma's words. Grandma had watched a lot of people die in her lifetime. Her parents were gone. Her husband was gone. She'd lost a beloved niece in a car accident and her best friend to cancer. She'd lost countless other friends and acquaintances along the way, too. Death walked by Grandma's side everywhere she went, and the woman knew it. That's why she made each of those cards special and personal, rather than sign her name to a clever poem that was written by the greeting card company. The present she gave him was a gift card. She told him that she had no idea what kids wanted these days, so she wasn't even going to bother trying. It was perfect. The next present he got was from the rest of his family. They'd joined together to get him one big gift that was too expensive for any one of them to get him on their own. He started to unwrap the package, and Ty jumped in to tell him that it was because the one Ryan had now was cracked and slow and didn't hold a charge. Their father told Ty to be quiet until Ryan opened the present. When Ryan pulled the wrapping paper off of his new cell phone, he sat there, staring at the box for several seconds. Ty went on to tell him that they would have waited for the new model to come out next month, and that one would have all sorts of new features, but there was a really good deal on this one since they had to make way for the new ones, and it was still a lot better than the piece of junk that Ryan was carrying in his pocket now. Once again, their father told Ty to be quiet and let Ryan open his own present. Ryan did open it. He pulled the new phone out of its package and held it in his hand, feeling the coolness of it against his skin. It was strange how something that would have meant so much to him a day before now seemed like a lump of useless glass and metal. He smiled and looked up at his family and thanked them. He told them that they shouldn't have spent so much money on him and that his old phone was good enough. His mother replied by telling him that she was worried that he would cut his finger open on that old cracked phone of his, and if he wasn't going to buy himself a new one, the rest of them would. Before Ryan could say much else about the phone, Ty had already taken it out of his hand. He was turning it on and setting it up as though the phone had been bought for him rather than his brother. Ryan could tell that their father was annoyed by this, but Ryan thought it was funny. He watched his family as they went about talking and tidying up the area, and he was struck by how much that moment meant to him. In the blink of an eye, at the whim of a stray thought, they could all vanish from existence. The fact that any of them were in that house on that night was more of a gift than anyone could ever give him.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.